The Falcons offense finally got right in week 4. We'll break down the film to see how Zac Robinson found his groove with Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Michael Penix Jr.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use all across the app. And guys, if you don't know, today's episode is an all 22 review where we'll be breaking down the offensive film of the Falcons' week 4 win over the Washington Commanders. Because it's the bye week, we're going to milk this thing, right? We don't have a crossover Thursday that we have to do tomorrow. And so therefore we get an extra day to really just sit in this film that is so illustrious, so demure, all that stuff and more. So today we'll focus primarily on the offense and the passing game. Almost exclusively. And tomorrow we'll get more into the defense. But, before we do that, I should probably introduce myself because I'm sure some of you are checking us out for the first time. I know many of you are everydayers, right? And that means as an everydayer, you listen to this podcast as your first listen each and every day, right? And you make this very humble host, none other than Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. AKA, your very first listen. And I appreciate all you everydayers. But, I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, right? Still going strong on this podcast. So we're coming up on 9 years as the humble host of the Locked On Falcons podcast this Thanksgiving. And, if you want to become an everydayer and make this podcast your first listen each and every day, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So let's get into the how and the why behind the offensive improvement. And, the first thing we'll say is Zac Robinson isn't beating the allegations that he also is one of the foremost everydayers of this podcast, because a lot of the complaints we had about the offensive struggles and why the offense, couldn't get right coming off of the heels of that Carolina game last week seemed to get corrected this week, right? It seemed like, if only you just listened to a daily podcast, you would have figured out how to fix the Falcons offense. But, I think 2 main things stood out to me that we talked about quite extensively on last week's extended all 22 review or all 22 review on the podcast was, they had better answers against Tampa 2 this week than they did against Carolina. They utilize a lot of smash concepts that are really good at attacking, that hole in that cover 2 defense that you see in Tampa 2. They hit that smash concept by my count at least 4 times, in this game. And then you also saw the quick game be a little bit more developed than we have seen to date, right? Some of that quick game was to Drake London underneath. A lot of it was to Bijan Robinson. One of the things we talked about last week was we wanted to see Bijan get featured more in the passing game because he would have some favorable matchups in this game against the slower-footed Washington Commander linebackers. And you saw that on full display on that 69-yard play where he was able to beat Bobby Wagner. A thing that we did not mention on the pod last week after the Carolina game, but we did talk about before the Carolina game, which was getting more Drake London featured in the slot. And the Falcons were able to do that against Washington. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Drake had his best game to date, right? We've talked about this before, where Drake is, I would argue, the best power slot in the NFL, right? The best big slot in the NFL. It's him or Chris Godwin are vying for the throne, right? Cooper Kupp vacated the throne a couple of years ago after the seasons he did, and he inherited the throne or the championship belt, whatever you want to call it, from people like Michael Thomas, people like Anquan Bolden from yesteryear in the NFL, and Drake London to me is the front runner, the heir apparent, so to speak, to come for the throne or to come for that championship belt. And I think you got to see quite a bit of that this past Sunday, and hopefully we'll continue to see more of that. And that's going to be, to me, the key to making Drake London such a core part of this offense and producing. Now, the other thing that stood out to me, Drake London had his best game today. I think Kyle Pitts also had his best game today. And that to me is notable given that Drake London played well, because I know has been a question among some Falcon fans that, they have argued that it's hard to maximize both Kyle Pitts and Drake London at the same time, given that both guys are kind of ideally suited to similar roles, which is Kyle Pitts being, that flex tight end is essentially a big slot, just like Drake London is. And can both of those guys, be maximized when you can only really feature one of those guys in your offense? And at least on Sunday, the Falcons were able to feature both of those guys, right? Now, the remaining question is, okay, well, we were able to get Pitts and London going. Can we get Pitts, London, and Darnell Mooney going? And, we didn't see that as consistently last year as we wanted to see it, just because, it was that week 5 win over Tampa Bay last year was probably the best example of them getting all three of those guys involved in the offense. But outside of that game, with a few exceptions, it wasn't that common. And we talked about this in the summer about the Falcons offense having a big 3, which was Drake London, Darnell Mooney in the passing game, and Bijan Robinson in the run game. And we wanted that big 3, not necessarily to be a big 4, but to be at least a big 3.5, that with Kyle Pitts not being the afterthought in the offense, that we wouldn't go more than a game or 2 without saying, oh yeah, Kyle Pitts had a great day today. Unlike last year where it was just like, basically Kyle Pitts had 4 to 5 good games last year and then was a non-factor for the remainder of the game. And we want to see that number increase by a significant amount. Now, when we talk about that big 3, through 4 games, we know Bijan has held up his end of the bargain. That's why we're not going to spend that much time talking about Bijan Robinson being great. We'll spend a little time talking about Bijan, but you guys already know Bijan's of greatness, right? We call him Blue Magic. We call him Mr. Walk on Water for, several reasons. I don't have to sit here and come on the podcast and explain to you why Bijan is good. You all can see it, right? And Drake London, became that other pillar, having his first good game. We're still waiting on Darnell Mooney to sort of fulfill his end of the bargain when it comes to the big 3. And to me, so far, Kyle Pitts has consistently been more than the half, right? He's probably been 0.75, 0.8, 0.9, maybe to the point where he's a fully formed entity of being that 4th option. And a big part of that, I think, is that we have seen improved usage of Kyle Pitts, right? Most of his production still is underneath catches on checkdowns and whatnot. But, we're seeing the Falcons getting the ball to him in those situations with, a negative being of the offense the first 3 weeks, a propensity of checkdowns. But we're also seeing Kyle Pitts get more opportunities down the field as a pass catcher and a route runner, right? We did the full breakdown of this, I believe, back in June, where we talked extensively about Kyle Pitts and how he was just not a non-factor in the play action passing game. And this to me was one of the biggest indictments of the team's play calling last year, which is why wasting Kyle Pitts' ability. And we broke down how in 2024, Kyle Pitts for the entirety of the 2024 season ran 13 routes the entire year off of play action. And only 2 of those routes, just 2 the entire season, he run more than 5 yards down the field. Through 4 games already this year, he's already beaten both of those numbers. He's run 18 routes so far off of play action, right? So he's on pace to getting, close to 80 routes. And I believe when we did the breakdown in June, that was the average among the top 10-ish tight ends in the NFL or so. So 80 of those opportunities, and around a dozen, I kind of lost count. Around a dozen of those have been for more routes, more than 5 yards down the field. So almost 2/3 of his play action routes are down the field. And we compared that to George Kittle back in June, where it was a little less than half of his routes, about 46% of his routes were, vertical routes, so intermediate or vertical routes off of play action, or half of his play action routes, I should stress, were vertical or intermediate routes. And so now the thing we got to get better with Kyle Pitts, and we've only seen 2 targets on those vertical routes for Kyle Pitts. But again, when you are literally starting from the bottom, it's like, hey, we're here, right? So, we're making progress. We're making big steps in the right direction. I think, we want to get more from Kyle Pitts in this offense, particularly in the play action passing game, particularly down the field. But you got to see a little bit of Kyle Pitts, as an intermediate threat with some of those smash concepts. And so we'll get into some of that a little bit later, talk more about why the play calling was better, and if the Falcons can continue to build off of this. We also saw that the quarterback was better, and we'll discuss how and why the play calling helped Michael Penix get going much earlier in this Washington game than we're used to. And that's what we'll do to continue today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode is sponsored by Mazda. And Mazda crafts cars for those who do more than simply move, from footwork to breath work. Athletes are the ones that sweat all the details, and Mazda is also sweating all the details, bringing you that same intention to how they craft every model. You can feel the Japanese craftsmanship in every detail, from the metallic accents to the available Napa leather upholstery. You can make everyday drives feel anything but the smooth handling and intuitive controls. With the all-wheel drive standard in every crossover SUV, you can drive with confidence through almost any season. Like our players, we sweat every detail, because when you make every move count, impossible becomes irrelevant. Mazda, move and be moved. So one of the things I think Michael Penix did a much better job against Washington, that is not related to the play calling, just isolating Michael Penix, is I think he did a better job with play extension. You saw a great throw that he made to Darnell Mooney along the sideline in the second quarter that was not completed, because Mooney was forced out and bobbled the ball going out of bounds. But you saw Penix sort of, step up in the pocket, roll to his left, and throw with accuracy and touch on that throw. And again, I still think there's the overall body of work still needs to show more consistency, but plays like that, as well as others in this game, to me showcase that Penix is not going to be as static in the pocket and be a little bit more willing to extend plays outside the pocket, so that in the event that the play calling isn't up to snuff, or the quarterback, particularly a young quarterback, doesn't have the right answers immediately, he can get to the right answers. That's the whole point of, having that play extending ability, having that off structure ability, being able to make plays outside the pocket. So I think that was a big improvement for Michael Penix, and hopefully we'll continue to see growth there. Another factor that played was Penix was just simply a lot more accurate this past Sunday than he was the previous Sunday. We know that Michael Penix plays with great anticipation already. He showed that again on Sunday against Washington. I think another factor that has less to do with Penix himself, or at least is not independent of Penix himself, is that the Falcons were able to get him going earlier, get him in a rhythm early. We've talked about that a number of times through his first 6 starts, that Michael Penix usually doesn't really get going until like midway, late in the second quarter. Once the Falcons get into their 4-minute drill, their 2-minute drill, that's when Penix starts to look sharper. In the first quarter and a half of pretty much every one of his 6 starts, it's just kind of him just kind of feeling it out. And I felt like Penix was much sharper early in the game. I think a lot of that had to do with some of the play calling Zac Robinson was doing. You saw the first pass, which was a screen that was dropped by Ray-Ray McCloud, but again, easy buttons to start the game in the scripted element of the game. His second pass on that opening series was that smash concept, that 26-yarder to Kyle Pitts, where, Washington got a little confused in their coverages. Then the third pass, you had a mesh rail concept. Penix missed the open throw to Bijan Robinson, sort of underthrowing it. They did come back to that later in the game on that 69-yard play in the third quarter, basically running the same play to the opposite side of the field to get that big play. But, the idea of that is, Penix wanted to throw the mesh and then saw Bijan open late on that particular play. And the mesh is meant to be an easy underneath completion on third down to get the thing going. And then on the second series, you saw another smash concept on the first design pass there. Then you saw that play action pass to Drake London over the middle for 15 yards. Then the Falcons tried an end around that didn't quite work, but I like the fact that the Falcons are trying to stretch defenses more horizontally. That has been something that they just really have not featured at all with Zac Robinson's offense, which was a regular feature of the Sean McVay offenses in LA. And I think the Falcons have the talent to do so with that. And so they didn't execute it because, they're not used to doing it, but I want to see more of plays like that, even if they don't work like we saw on Sunday. And then the fourth pass play of that second series was a quick slant against, an inverted Tampa 2 look from Washington, where Drake London was able to win for a significant gain. Then their fifth play was another smash concept variation, this time to Bijan, in the red zone. And then you had the touchdown to Drake London on the sixth pass play of that second series, which was basically a spot route, which was, again, another sort of quick concept to get the ball out quickly. And so a lot of those concepts that the Falcons are running are sort of easy buttons, which is what we discussed last week. The Falcons lack in their offense, a lot of high-low concepts, a lot of quick game concepts, easy reads, easy throws for Michael Penix. And I think those types of plays, did it wonders to get Penix going earlier in this game than we have traditionally seen him in his previous 6 starts. And I want to continue to see designs like this and play calls like this early in games to try to get Penix going, get him in the rhythm and whatnot. And so I think Zac Robinson did a good job. He gets a lot of criticism for this offensive shortcomings. And, as somebody who was the OG Zac Robinson critic, this is music to my ears, but it's just everybody trying to get on my level, with the Zac Robinson criticism. And, we've gone beyond just, blaming all the Falcons issues on Zac Robinson, because in Zac we trust. But it's not to sit here and say that those criticisms, are wrong on Zac Robinson, but a lot of the criticism I've heard directed at Zac Robinson feel very nitpicky to me. I think the whole, his offense is too predictable gets a little bit based off of the pistol shotgun under center stuff is very much overblown, but I'm sure that will be a topic of discussion we'll discuss later this week or early next week when we can really unpack that whole. To me, I think the 2 main criticisms that we had of Zac Robinson from before still remain this year. And particularly this year, one of those criticisms is that, and we talked about this extensively last week, was his offense is vertical. It's a vertical offense. I was going to say too vertical. I don't think that's fair. You can be vertical or whatever. But when defenses have been, more successful limiting the vertical element of the offense, they haven't had good answers, to counter that other than we'll just run the football. And I think on Sunday, they had much better answers for that with the quick game and all the things we talked about before. And hopefully we'll continue to see that growth and development there to have answers for that. The other criticism of the Zac Robinson offense, which is a carryover from last year, is the lack of play action passing, right? And we focus on that so much this offseason, and that remains an issue. The Falcons are no longer dead last in play action usage this year. They're bottom 3, but they are second to last. I believe Houston's dead last in terms of success rate off of play action this year. So they're not utilizing play action. They're not effective when they do use play action. And, I think through now 21 games, if we're including the Bruno game where Zac Robinson didn't even try to run play action last year in week 1 against the Steelers, I think we have enough of a sample size to suggest that the play action is probably just going to be an inherent weakness of Zac Robinson's play calling. And as I said a week or 2 ago, I can't remember exactly when it was, that I'm not necessarily optimistic or confident that that's going to change, that we're going to still be talking about that at the end of the season. But, we'll see how it all plays out. But I think another sort of underrated factor in why the Falcons play action passing attack isn't necessarily working, and it was on display on Sunday, is that maybe Michael Penix is also not as good at the play action, particularly when it comes to turning his back to the defense as we would like. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the NFL season is here, and FanDuel is here to make sure that you are ready with this can't miss offer, because right now new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use all across the FanDuel app. And there's so many different ways to win with FanDuel, whether it's, for football, basketball, baseball, whatever sports are going on. Again, obviously, I'm so focused on football, I don't even know what's going on in the rest of the sports world, but FanDuel knows, right? And, with football, you can do player props, you can do a same game parlay, you can bet against the spread. I know yesterday, I think I said, the Minnesota Cleveland game is a Thursday game. That's actually Sunday morning. The Thursday game is actually San Francisco, LA. And if you're looking at that Thursday game, the Rams are 5.5 point favorites. If you're still looking at that Minnesota Cleveland game, now that Dylan Gabriel, the left-handed sensation, other than Michael Penix, is going to start, the Vikings are 3.5 point favorites in that game. So why are you waiting? What are you waiting for? go check out FanDuel.com, download the FanDuel app today to get started. And today's episode is also brought to you by Monarch Money. Since most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether we're talking 401ks, properties, investments, you want to, you wind up leaving a lot of money on the table. And that's where Monarch Money comes in. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that's going to bring your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or on your phone. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you, and you can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel free, and in control of your money without ever having to touch a spreadsheet. All right, so don't let this financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use the code LOCKEDONINFO at monarchmoney.com for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNFL. So I have a question about Michael Penix and his effectiveness in the play action. That question is Michael Penix good at turning his back to the defense? And right now, through 7 starts and, garbage time in 2-3 other games, we have a very limited sample size to really determine definitively one way or the other. And part of the problem is he isn't asked to do that very much because the Falcons don't ask him to do a lot of play action in his offense. So we don't really know until the Falcons give him more of those play action opportunities, which if you've been in every day of this podcast for, the last 9 months, that's one of the things we want to see more of. And that's a big area of improvement for Zac Robinson. But based off of that limited sample size, it's been a mixed bag so far, right? There were 2 plays to me against Washington that kind of illustrate the mixed bag nature. You have one play that worked and then another play that didn't work. And the first play was that 15-yard throw on the second series to Drake London. It was a great throw over the middle to Drake London. The second one was the interception he threw off of play action to Mikey Sanders in the third quarter. And both were play action passes. Both were plays where he was, asked to turn his back to the defense while faking the handoff. And then I think he kind of predetermined both of those throws. Like he basically knew, I'm going to throw this football to Drake London on this situation, because again, that's the design of the play, which we're not sitting here saying like he made a poor decision there, right? But to me, it's interesting because the completion he had to Drake London, like at the moment where you could see the beat before he decided to wind up and throw, that throw wasn't open, right? There was a defender, I think it was Frankie Louvu, that was in the throwing window underneath. At the moment when Penix made that decision to throw, there was no indication that defender was going to move out of that window. Now, fortunately, he did kind of turn his back to the ball. But I sit here and I think like Penix may have heard the slander about, his inability to throw over the middle. And he was basically like, I'm going to rip this dig to Drake London come hell or high water. If that sounds like I'm knocking him for making that decision, I'm not. That's not the point of what I'm trying to say. Oftentimes when it comes to attacking the middle of the field, where you have a lot of bodies potentially underneath defenders, safeties, cheating down, all that stuff, sometimes you just have to rip it and trust that your guy's going to make a play. And that's exactly what Penix did on that particular way. He ripped it, he threw it high. So even if that defender did stay there, that, Frankie Louvu, whoever it was, would potentially not make the play. And Drake London went up and grabbed it. And so we applaud Michael Penix for that. But in terms of, I question basically what I'm saying. I question whether he saw it before he threw it, right? Which again, you don't always have that opportunity. You kind of have to anticipate the windows coming open is kind of the point. But because of that play, questioning whether he saw it in conjunction with the interception that came later, which is the opposite side of the coin, questioning whether he saw it. And then this time he paid the price because I don't know if he saw it, right? Where he, again, predetermined, I'm going to Drake London. We're going to run this out pattern. And he threw the ball too flat. But I don't think he saw Sanders still, right? His body language upon immediately releasing that football to me indicated that he knew immediately after he let go of that football, he messed up. And to me, that is indicative. Again, we don't know the answer. And I haven't heard any sound bites where Penix has been asked specifically about that interception and what went wrong. We don't know the answer, but like that body language to me indicates to me that like you didn't see the defender. And so once you let go of the football, you realize, oh, I saw the defender and I knew I messed up. And to me, if he had seen Sandwich Joe, I don't think he would have thrown it that flat. Now, I think there were things that Washington did on the play that we'll probably get into on the extended all 22 review that may have thrown a wrench into it. I know JT O'Sullivan broke that down in his film breakdown and whatnot. And so that could have contributed to Penix not thinking Sandwich Joe was going to be there. But the reason why all that matters, regardless of whether you agree with me or not, is because, so much of the discussion over the last month has been about the Falcons and their quote unquote predictable quarterback alignments, and they run too much pistol and they don't do enough under center. And while I do think that the Falcons could and should benefit from doing more under center, particularly when it comes to selling their play action, and hopefully that would be something that could enhance their play action so that we're not talking about one of the worst play action passing attacks in the NFL like we currently are discussing. It's basically Houston is sort of in the basement and the Falcons are basically standing on their shoulders, which is the only reason why they're not drowning in the basement as it's being flooded from above. If you love my analogy there when it comes to play action. But, I do think under center in theory could improve that and get them out of the basement. But so much of that conversation, understandably, centers around Zac Robinson and his shortcomings. Why is he calling under center? This is bad play calling. And I don't know if enough of that conversation is centering around Michael Penix, that maybe one of the reasons why Zac Robinson isn't calling it is because, Penix isn't as good at it as he needs to be. Now, when we raise the question on why, I know in the Locked On Falcons Discord, the response is, the why is, again, because Zac Robinson is an idiot. But I don't believe in that necessarily. But again, I don't think Penix gets enough attention in that equation, right? Because he lacks experience under center. And he just may not be as good turning his back to the defense. I remember having this conversation about Marcus Mariota at the beginning of the 2022 season, right? That was a contributing factor to that ongoing conversation back then about why this offense could be better with Desmond Ridder, because he seemed a little bit more comfortable turning his back to the defense and making those reads, although he was predetermining a lot of those throws and whatnot. And again, ripping it, seeing it, ripping it regardless of whether you see it. Sometimes you got to do that. But we don't really know where Penix fits on this paradigm. And again, I think in order to find the answer to that question, in order to answer this question, is Penix good turning his back to the defense? And therefore, is there a lot of still untapped potential in terms of the Falcons' play action passing attack, which would be greatly benefiting them, their ability to generate more explosive plays? And hopefully, that will lead to more scores rather than, them moving the ball effectively between the 20s and then things grinding to a halt in the red zone, which, again, they did a better job in the red zone. Shout out to Trayshawn Diaz. I know he was pushing, hey, we got to get more play action in the red zone. And you saw that on the Kyle Pitts touchdown in this game. But it all sits there and you just wonder, we need to see more Penix operating in play action in order to find the answer. And again, that's something I'm 100% in favor, but I'm not as convinced as the rest of the world that, that might not be a fact. It may just simply be that we may discover over time. And again, we'll see, that's not a strength. That Penix is more Mariota than he is Kirk Cousins or Desmond Ridder when it comes to that specific element. So hopefully we'll get a more definitive answer, because the Falcons will continue to give Penix those opportunities via play action, and he'll continue to grow and learn from the mistakes that he made on that one interception on Sunday. But we'll just sort of have to see on that front. So those are my kind of thoughts on the film of the Falcons offense. Tomorrow we'll take a deeper look into the film of the Falcons defense. We'll talk about the run defense. We'll talk about the young players. We'll talk about the pass rush and whether or not, strong start has kind of faded the last 2 weeks. And should we be expecting more of this pass rush moving forward, or is what we've seen the last 2 weeks more likely to be what we're going to see the rest of the season? So that will be a big topic of discussion tomorrow on the podcast. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen if you want to get the defensive side of the All 22 breakdown by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL podcast that will get you geared up for those upcoming matchups between the Browns and Vikings, 49ers and Rams all week long. 2 shows daily on Locked On NFL. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.